hello to my subscribers and welcome to the Neurodive Corner. Now that I got my little rant out of the way and out of my system, we can get back to programming as usual, and we can start talking about, we can continue talking about trauma. So in the last video for the series about tips for caregivers and such, we talked about trauma and how it presents on caregivers. Even when you think you have this, I got this under control, a lot of the times when you are a caregiver, you are suffering vicarious trauma and you might not even be aware. And that is where today's video comes in. We're gonna talk about some trauma responses that are not typical and are usually not what people expect from somebody that has gone through trauma. Now, trauma is a very interesting thing. You know, a lot of people think trauma is one particular event, and that is not what trauma is. You can go through traumatic events, but trauma is the response to the event and subsequently to triggers that might remind you of the event. So that's why we call it trauma response now, and that's why there is so much the last 10 to 15 years there has been a big move to learning and doing trauma informed care throughout health and human services. So with trauma, a lot of the times, because it's subtle and because people sometimes are under that trauma and trauma response for so long, trauma in a person can start looking like personality. Trauma in a family can start looking like hereditary traits. And trauma in a community can actually start looking like culture. And that's why it's so important to know that there are certain behaviors that are trauma responses and people don't even attach them together. So one of the big ones, especially for caregivers, is people pleasing or fawning. There is a group of people that when they encounter their triggers that remind them of their traumatic event, they go into this default mode of people pleasing and trying to acquiesce and appease whoever is surrounding them. And this, for a lot of people, comes across as somebody that is nurturing. Hi, Brett Sanderson, thanks for joining. Kaysar Sayed, I hope I'm not butchering your name, but thank you for joining the live stream. So back to the trauma response. So fawning is a trauma response that in society has not been identified as that because it comes across as personality. You know, it comes across as, somebody that's very sweet, somebody that's nurturing, somebody that cares. And people sometimes don't realize that that is a trauma response, that some people have gone through life using charm and using all of that in order to survive, survive their particular surroundings and whatever traumatic event, they experience or continue to experience. So fawning, people pleasing, it's a trauma response that a lot of people are not aware of. Another one is binge eating. A lot of the times people, obviously we know nowadays that there's stress-related eating and stuff, but there's actually a binge eating disorder that it is attached to trauma. And obviously this behavior usually doesn't get identified as something related to trauma just because people, the stigma around weight and body image and all of that. But binge eating is a trauma response. A lot of the times people will find that comfort and that sort of like sense of security in eating and overeating, binge eating. Another atypical trauma response comes from sort of like, how can I put this? So, hoarding food, for example, or actually just the act of hoarding. Now, this one can be very specific. Food hoarding has a very, for whatever reason, there's a really strange connection between physical assault and food hoarding. A lot of the times you will find victims of SA that will get into hoarding food and stuff like that, and it is something, a lot of the time some of them do it purposely, but for a lot of them it's something that starts happening as a response to that trauma. Because obviously if I'm hoarding food or things like that, in a conscious way or unconscious way, you are like you're repelling others. This comes along too, where even though fire setting, we can all agree that fire setting behavior, it's obviously not only a trauma response, but that is some serious issue. So those two components, the food hoarding and fire setting behaviors, have a very weird connection with SA. So those are atypical trauma responses that you can see in people. Another trauma response can be disassociating and like detachment, when you see somebody that appears flat affect and kind of like aloof, and they seem like they are cool, calm, and collected. That is not always the case. For some people, that is actually the default in the trauma response to traumatic events, because the same way some people fight or flight, some people fawn, and some people freeze. You know, again, trauma is not something that you can address it cognitively, but you're not going to work through it cognitively only. It is something that your body is already primed to do, and you do it unconsciously. You know, trauma response obviously is what people think as the lizard brain. It's that caveman ability to be able to respond in a moment's notice to any perceived threat. Obviously, when we're no longer living in caves or having to, you know, fight for our food, but our body's still primed to address those threats. And you got to remember that part of your body is not connected immediately to cognitive information. A lot of the times it's actually something that happens in the spur of the moment and you can't even explain. This happens a lot in interactions with authority. That's why a lot of people, sometimes they hear somebody speak loud or anything like that, and I can attest to this because I'm like that. If I hear somebody speak in an assertive tone, my immediate response is to apologize or try to mediate, try to like fix whatever it is going on. So I can attest to the fact that sometimes your trauma response is just you're just gonna freeze and not have any type, or you're gonna disassociate, and it's gonna look like you're cool, calm, and collected, but you're actually in survival mode at that point. So that's I just wanted to share extra information in trauma. If you guys have other trauma responses that you have experienced or you have knowledge of in your life and you want to share in the comments, please feel free to do so. If you have any ideas for new topics and moving forward, or other videos that you would like to watch, just leave it in the comments and I'll be glad to try and work something out. As always, stay safe, stay healthy, take care of each other, and we'll be talking soon. Bye bye.